All right, hello everyone. I want to welcome everyone to today's Distillery webinar. My name is Peter. I'm a senior strategist here at Distillery, and I once again want to thank everyone for joining us today. Now, whether you've worked with us before or this is your first interaction with us, I want to welcome everyone, particularly our three panelists for joining us today. Now, the topic of today's conversation is all about pivoting your business while staying true to your brand purpose. Now, I know that many of us have firsthand experience with this, whether it's our own businesses having to pivot during this coronavirus lockdown, or seeing our favorite brands shift in order to survive and excel in this lockdown. But I'm sure our three panelists will have lots to say on this topic. But before we dive in, I just want to go through a little bit about what we'll cover today. So first, I'm going to give more in-depth introductions to our three panelists. I'll then go through our views as Distillery about pivoting and brand values. We'll then go into panelist presentations where each of our panelists will spend a few minutes to give his or her thoughts on this topic. We'll then go into a broader panel discussion, and we'll close out with a Q&A from the audience. So before we dive in, just a few minutes for intros and admin. So what we will be doing is be putting everyone on mute. So if you do have a question, you can write to us on the Q&A app, and we'll do our best to answer all these questions at the end. I will try to tell you where that is on your Zoom, but I think everyone has a different configuration, but it should be at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A function. And if you want to continue the conversation beyond the webinar, we hope you do, because we'll share our details at the end of this webinar. So once again, my name is Peter Hoffer. I'll be your host and guide through this session, and I am joined by three very talented and very experienced speakers today. So our first panelist is Robin Bond, who is the founder of Co-Definery, specialist management consultancy for agencies. Now, he advises CEOs and founders on improving standout, conversion, and profit by getting beyond dated best practice and adopting a more modern approach to growth. And he's also a columnist on agency and client dynamics for Marketing Week, a regular industry speaker, mentor for She Says, and a former member of IPA's New Business Group and Direct Marketing Association's Agencies Council. So welcome, Robin. Next, we have Melda Simon, founder of Little Fires. Now, Melda has over 15 years of experience in brand communications, working across a number of different sectors and brands, including Dove, Gucci, Max Factor, and more. She's worked in-house at Unilever, developing purpose-driven brands and industry-wide campaigns around gender equality in the advertising industry. Melda is now the founder of Little Fires, a sustainability and PR consultancy helping brands and entrepreneurs to make a positive social impact. Welcome, Melda. And finally, we have Thomas Knowles of the British Museum. Thomas has a background in fine art and has been employed within the museum sector for over 8 years. During this time, he has worked for the National Portrait Gallery, the Royal Academy of Art, and Yale University, specifically focusing on events. Thomas currently works as the membership events manager at the British Museum, where he develops engagement opportunities for the museum's extensive network of friends. So welcome again to all of our panelists. Now, before we delve into each of the presentations, I just wanted to briefly introduce Distillery in case you're not familiar with what we're all about. So the wider Distillery team is based across offices in London and Singapore, and we really help focus on developing and blowing up content for brands in order to win new fans. We are an international content studio that uses data and insight to really maximize the content for the brands that we work with. And we also like to think of ourselves as distillers of great ideas to help brands create content. We're really big on collaboration, and strategy is at the heart of what we do. And I think a lot of that feeds into the topic and why we decided that why pivoting makes sense. So if we go to the next slide, we'll have hopefully a very well-known GIF when it comes to pivots. This is the first thing we thought of when talking about this topic. But the stats that really jumped out at us was that, even in normal settings, 20% of businesses undergo radical change. So brands are constantly having to reevaluate challenges, whether it's emerging technology or new competitors, or in our case, a global pandemic. From a distillery perspective, we've actually had to pivot twice. So for the first time, the first challenge we've had with pivoting is working with our clients to help them use the best strategy in order to pivot. So for example, we are helping clients reimagine their current content because most brands aren't able to go out to film or create content right now. So what we're doing to help them is repurposing, refocusing their attention on specific channels that they may not have been looking at before. And on a personal level, we've had to pivot just as a small business. I'm sure like many of you, we're working from home at the moment, working across different locations, not just in the UK, but across Europe and across APAC. And one of our key things that makes working at a distillery quite fun is that we're quite a social, and we really care about little things like each other's birthdays. So last week, for example, we had a colleague who was celebrating a very special birthday. Normally we would get a Colin the Caterpillar cake for the office, but of course we can't do that. So we managed to do a virtual lunch where we all got takeout and managed to eat and share on a Zoom call. So it's those little things that we face that in order to keep that good camaraderie important to us. But enough about us and distillery and our views on pivoting. Let me pass it first to our first panelist, Robin, who has a few thoughts to share with you.
Thank you, Peter. Much appreciated. Very happy to be here. So I won't reiterate the bio, but just to give you a little bit of I suppose, a caveat on what I'd like to talk about. So because I spend most of my time thinking about the dynamic between clients and agencies, I'm going to speak a little bit less about some of the higher profile sort of COVID-19 related pivots, a little bit more about SMEs. So I think for me, pivoting is perhaps a little bit different when you're maybe smaller or less well known. It's a bit maybe less like turning an oil tanker than it may be for some larger organizations. So try and make some advice a little bit more practical. So yeah, first thing I want to talk about is a language thing. What on earth is a pivot? It's sort of come to mean this dramatic change of tack, and I think it's really important to be clear about this stuff. So sometimes it might well be a full proposition change. It could be that you're a baker and you decide to be a butcher. They're obviously two very different businesses, but equally it could just be a shift in the marketplace that you're in. So if you're a baker known for bread and you start doing Colin the Caterpillar birthday cakes, then that's perhaps more of a subtle shift. So the point I'm making is not that there is a right or wrong definition, but just that the words that we use as business leaders are very subjective. So if you get the words right, then any kind of change in your business, it doesn't have to be scary for the team. So I think when you start talking about pivots, people immediately might jump to the wrong conclusion about what you're intending. So are there going to be new positions in the business? Am I going to be redundant? Am I going to be out of my comfort zone, etc.? So language really does matter. I suppose the other big variable is that it might not be permanent. And I think we've probably seen a lot of that within the this pandemic. Things like Brewdog and LVMH talking about making hand sanitizer. We've got Dyson and General Motors and some of the F1 teams clubbing together to make ventilators. Even down to more simple changes, restaurants offering takeout, and right down to sort of simple promotions like your mobile phone operator perhaps offering you free data. So there's a huge variety of changes that get kind of lumped together under this grand term of pivot. But one thing I would say, again, I think for people of a certain age, it was a matter of absolute public knowledge that M&S, during World War II, they created ration clothing. And this was a change in their business. Well, not a grand departure, but it was a service that they provided for the country as part of the war effort. And that wasn't forgotten about for a long time. So doing good and helping in time of need is certainly something that would justify a pivot, whether it's a grand change or not. So just moving on to the next slide, please. I just want to have a quick word about brand purpose. It's another concept that gets talked about a lot. Some people really believe in it, some people less so. But the sort of general advice when you're changing your business seems to be to lean into your brand purpose. I think there's a good degree of sense in that. But what I would say is, again, there's a nuance in there. So perhaps more accurately, just don't contravene people's expectations of you. So my sort of sideline writing in Marketing Week, many of you will know Mark Ritson. He drew the contrast recently between Virgin Atlantic, who declined to pay their employees during the initial hiatus brought about by the lockdown. And Richard Branson copped a huge amount of flack for that, not least because of the stance he's made in the past about supporting employees. If you contrast that with what Ryanair, the kind of abuse they might have copped had they taken the same stance, it wouldn't have been nearly as bad. So I suppose the lesson, not just lean into your values, but just be decent. You know, just make sure that if you change, make sure that doesn't contravene what people already think about you. So yeah, if you're just decent like M&S or Brewdog or Dyson, that is a good rule of thumb, if you like, when thinking about your purpose and your values. I suppose just turning attention to SMEs particularly, I think it's sometimes useful to consider your point of view as much as your values. I think for a lot of agencies in particular, your values are sometimes sort of stuck in the sort of abstract concepts, perhaps just some words painted on a wall. Thinking more about your point of view, I think, is actually more differentiating. It's something that you can leverage internally and externally. So think of it perhaps as the reason why you do what you do. So certainly when I'm working with businesses and helping them work this stuff out, do something called the Podium Test. So imagine that you are representing your company, you're stood on a stage somewhere at a big event, there's 1,000 people in front of you, all waiting to hear you speak. And you've got to come on stage and you've got to say, here at wherever you work, we believe that, and then you need to finish that statement. You need to say what it is that you believe in most strongly. Now, the only caveat is that you've got to excite half the room and you've got to alienate half the room. And it's quite a fun exercise because it forces you to think about things that you believe that not everybody believes. So it's a kind of an antidote to what politicians fall over all the time, which is, we believe in education, we believe in healthcare. Everybody believes in those things. They're not differentiating. So as I say, if you're going to pivot and you're thinking about purpose and values, think also about your point of view, because that's something which is going to be able to be leveraged in the way that you take that new proposition to market. So on to the next slide, I suppose just to perhaps capture some ideas from the last things that I've spoken about. Firstly, this is all about risk, really. If you're going to change your business, the degree to which you do it and the impact it's going to make and the returns you're going to create, you need to think this stuff through. So firstly, language really does matter. Pivoting, as I say, is a matter of degree, whether it's a strategic shift or a tactical tweak. It impacts the level of risk you're taking on, the level of investment you need to make, the potential returns you're likely to get, and also particularly about it's how people feel about that change. So second point is make sure you get people on board. The classic agency issue is being a service business looking to pivot and become more like a product company. And clearly that's a very different business model. So I've seen agencies torn apart by trying to do this and trying to keep a foot in both camps. If you go from being a business that offers very tailored solutions to one that's much more built on off-the-shelf solutions, be they physical products or virtual products, it turns you into more of a volume play. So it changes your culture. You can be a business all about innovation and creativity. If you start to move towards a productized model, you start to become much more about scale and efficiency. And that's a very difficult balance to strike, and very difficult politically as a leader of that kind of business. And last point, just on values, I think they do matter, but really only up to a point. You know, obviously just be decent in the new thing that you're doing, whether it contravenes what you've done in the past or not. I think, you know, a lot of agencies will obsess about your values, but actually think more about your behaviors. It's how those values are brought to life. And if they can substantiate, you know, your position, you're in a good place. If it proves that the pivoted offer that you're creating is, you know, worthwhile, and you know, that you believe in it, then your behaviors are probably doing a good job for you. So just to move on to the last slide, a final thought to leave you with, I suppose just a concept to try and bring all this stuff together. Many of you will be familiar with this Japanese concept of ikigai, which means a reason for being. So what I like about this is that it brings some abstract concepts together. And I think that's often an important but missing piece of the jigsaw. Agencies like to think about this stuff in isolation, and I'm sure that's true of a lot of businesses. So, you know, being purposeful, doing what you love is important. Stuff that you're competent at, that's important. There being some kind of market or demand for this stuff. It being a place where you can make a living. These are all important but very interrelated concepts. So I think whether you're a brand or whether you're an agency or any other kind of business, think holistically about your entire customer experience, everything that you do as well as everything that you say. And I think if you are looking to pivot the organization to whatever degree, this is a good concept to stimulate that thinking. So I will leave you there. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Robin. I think that that exercise you mentioned about not being for everyone, of making those statements, would be a great exercise just to do at a team meeting, even now. So it'll be interesting to see what pops up across companies across the country. All right, so now I'd like to hand it over to Melda.
Hello, hi everyone. And again, thanks to Peter, Steve, the distillery team for being here today. Looking forward to the discussion. I'll speak just for a few moments on the challenges and actions we've seen some brands take over the past few months. But before we get to what's behind this slide, perhaps just a general observation, picking up on something Robin touched on just now, actually, which is there's been lots of discussion and debate within our industry for some time around the role of brand purpose and social purpose. You know, is it a fad? Does every brand need to play a meaningful and have a positive societal impact in the world? I think whatever side of the fence you fall on in terms of that debate, I think what we're seeing now is that the brands that do have a core purpose, a core set of values, and are living up to those values up and down their supply chain, up and down their entire value chain across multiple stakeholder groups, are the brands that seemingly are surfing and navigating this crisis better and more resiliently than most. And I think that's a trend that we're going to see coming out of this. Just to read a few stats that I was reading just recently, 84% of people want brands to focus communications on how their products and services help with pandemic-related challenges. That's 84%. And 64% of consumers say how brands behave during a crisis will have a huge impact on their likelihood to buy. And I think we were seeing that trend of consumers holding brands more accountable pre-pandemic, and I think we're just going to see it continue and increase. And I think the brands with purpose will weather that in whatever the future normal looks like. So first of all, you know, back to this slide, I think what we're seeing a host of brands do across different sectors is get back to their core expertise, number one, and the core foundations and purpose of why they exist. So we've seen many alcohol brands turn to starting to produce hand sanitizer. We've seen the fashion houses start to make masks and PPE equipment. I like this BrewDog example. Yes, they've repurposed their production line to produce hygienic hand rub, as you can see from this visual, but they've also pivoted to move to online bars. So this is where their community, their consumers can come online and have a drink, you know, virtually via whatever platform. And I think what's enabled BrewDog to pivot so kind of seamlessly and effectively is going back to what that core purpose is. In the statement by the co-founder of BrewDog, you know, he says, community is at the absolute core of who we are and what we've always done. And just knowing that their purpose in the world is not just to sell beer, but to build community has enabled them to pivot in what seems like a very simple way, online bars, but it's very, very true to that brand and why they exist. We're seeing eBay also behave in quite in a meaningful way. As a direct response to the COVID crisis, they launched the Up and Running program, which has put millions of pounds in support behind small businesses and retailers that don't have an online presence. eBay has been helping them create e-commerce sites with free tutorials, etc. And again, you know, when you look at the core foundations of eBay's expertise and their purpose, they are about connecting buyers with sellers to create economic growth. And what this brand has done is go back to that core value and those core purposes in order to innovate and adapt very quickly to their audience's needs. Morrison's likewise. I'll just read actually a statement from their chief executive on the back of the Feeding the Nation campaign. Their CEO says, "The company has paid a lot of attention to its core purpose. It isn't what they do or how they do it, it's why a company exists. And we currently believe the biggest contribution we can make in the country is playing our full part in feeding the nation." So clear set of values, and again, going back to your foundational expertise, but core purpose of why you exist in the world. And finally, the Lifebuoy image is from Unilever. So decades of heritage across the world through their Lifebuoy and Domestos brands in helping improve sanitation and hygiene around the world. They've pulled those two brands together to accelerate and scale education programs across the world to promote better hygiene, put millions of pounds behind it. But going back to their expertise and foundations as a brand has helped them do that effectively and quickly. And then, of course, if we go to the next slide, please, we have the brands where their immediate expertise or relevance in terms of a critical response to the crisis isn't immediately relevant, but they are still finding meaningful ways to contribute. And I would argue that as a brand, you know, you should be finding a meaningful way to contribute to what's going on in the world. It's what consumers expect of you. You know, we do believe that brands can play a role in helping our lives and the world be better. We know that. There's endless research to suggest that consumers expect brands to play a more positive role in society. And these are just examples here of how brands are doing it just by changing the context and their messaging to be more in sync with the way the world is feeling and their audiences is feeling. And we're seeing brands inspire, entertain, provide hope and optimism in a different variety of ways. The picture of the father and son here is from Birdseye, a really interesting example actually. Huge demand since COVID and lockdown of frozen food, pressure on their supply chain. So yes, at a product level, the brand has quickly rationalized and simplified its product range, stuck to a core range. It's also pulled back all its product messaging. No one wants to see a piece of messaging about a product you can't buy in store or online. But instead of going completely dark, they've shifted their messaging in a matter of days, in a matter of weeks, produced a campaign called What's Your Tea? What's for Tea? Very much at the heart of what family life is at the moment, obsession over what's for dinner, lots of more home cooking and family meals. And they've provided a bunch of recipes, meal inspiration, life hacks to help families kind of make the most of frozen food. So a really, really interesting example of how you can just kind of be helpful and meaningful in a way that's contextual. I think the Nationwide have also done, if you haven't seen this campaign, grab a tissue, go watch it on YouTube. It's a bit of a tearjerker, a really good example of how we expect and want brands to inspire us and give us hope and be optimistic in this time. Not everything has to be catastrophic or incite fear, you know, and I think brands can play a role in that, and Nationwide have done that brilliantly. They took their Voices campaign, adapted it to COVID, got people to record messages to themselves in 6 months' time, and what you see is really honest, authentic stuff, content that really captures the sentiment of where we're at now. And then of course you've got the Budweiser What's Up campaign, the iconic campaign, rebooted for COVID times, encouraging quarantine, doing so in a way that really speaks to that brand's humor and full personality. So I think what we're learning here is context is key. Robin touched on language. I think if we add context and tone of voice to that, I think what we're seeing is that brands can play a role in distracting us, in inspiring us, and in making us feel really hopeful. And then the only final point I want to make, and it does touch on values, the next slide please, is about trust and integrity. Robin mentioned the Virgin example and Richard Branson's backlash, but I think it's an important point when we talk about values, which this webinar is about, is that you have to live and breathe them always within your organisation and across your own stakeholder groups. That's not, it's your immediate employees, it's also your extended supply chain, before you can go out and talk about them publicly. And all communications are under increasing scrutiny. So every comment, every statement, every act you make is even more under the spotlight, and it's really important to behave in ways that are sincere, that are full of integrity. And it's an important lesson to us to remember around ensuring that our values are embedded within our staff and our organisations first and foremost, in order for us to weather this storm. The example here is the backlash against Virgin after asking their staff to take unpaid leave. There has been a U-turn on that now, and this visual is from down the road from me in Crystal Palace actually, and the graffiti on our local JD Wetherspoon pub. So I think more so than ever we need to be looking at everything we're doing across that value chain.
All right, thank you, Melda. I think it was really good just to see the good and bad examples, but also to get your thoughts and insights of what made them great, what made them not so great, and lessons that we can learn to take away for our own companies and brands. All right, so next up we have Thomas to talk about his experiences at the British Museum.
Thank you, Peter and Steve, and everyone at Distillery for having us. Really inspiring, actually, to hear Robin and Melda speak there. I've been frantically taking notes, so look forward to speaking to you later. So I'm just going to be giving you initially just a brief introduction to membership at the British Museum, why it's important, the issues that we found from having no museum to actually visit at the moment, how we've responded to some of those issues, and the feedback that we've been getting, and then also what we've learned and the legacy of the things that we've learned too. So initially, why is membership important to the museum? It really helps to develop a community and a support network that helps to safeguard the collection and the museum itself. But also from a financial point of view, membership alone brings in 5 million profit to the museum every year. Membership also acts as a base level for other development opportunity with patronage and corporate sponsors. And together we bring in about 30 million for the museum every year. So it really is vitally important for the safeguarding of the collection and the museum's longevity. So I work on the events team. So I'm the membership events manager. We found that members are vitally important for the retention of those members. So we have about 78,000 members in total, of which Peter is one, and actually one of our membership council members. And we found that if a member was to engage in just 1 to 2 events a year, their renewal rate typically went from 3 years to 5 years, and we have close to 200 events every year. So something for everybody. It includes backstage tours of the conservation studios, interaction with our curators, exhibition private views, but the issue with all of this is everything is on site. And for good reason. We want to bring members on site. When they're there, they can take advantage of the facilities that we have for them, so the members room, they can also use the shop, and also the cafes. But obviously without any of these resources at the moment, it left us in a very difficult situation. So how did we respond? We decided that we wanted to try and replicate our usual offers, but digitally, as best as we could. And we decided to focus on the primary offers of membership, so the exclusivity, philanthropy, and also the sense of community that can come from the membership program. And also to look at the museum's global impact and importance rather than just the building itself and the collection. So the day before lockdown, myself and a few colleagues frantically ran around the museum to the conservation studios and also to the curatorial offices and tried to record some messages to our membership team, to our members, sorry, from those colleagues. The videos were awful, very much found footage, had a kind of Blair Witch quality, but we also had a brilliant video editor who helped to kind of make them usable. And once we had some initial content, we started to work on our digital strategy. So if you can see here actually an example of one of the emails that we're using. So traditionally we send out 1 email to our members every month. we decided to bring that forward to doing one every week. And we wanted to pack that with lots of new content to keep them engaged, to keep them connected to the institution and the collection that they love. One thing that we anticipated was our audience is primarily an older demographic. So we knew that we couldn't just jump into producing a digital events program. We needed there to be a journey of engagement. So we started initially with providing blogs and written materials, something that our members were used to and engaging with and enjoying. Then we moved on to introductory videos, so discussing objects within the collection and themes, always with our curatorial team, which is a big benefit for the members that they get to engage directly with that team. Following this, we decided we wanted to bring the members a bit more interaction with these videos. So we invited questions in these emails, and we got a really positive response to this. So many people sent through some fantastic questions, and then a really brilliant response rate to the actual to the videos themselves. Something that's been really important for us throughout this is the well-being of our members. So we also produced membership videos of workshops, so yoga workshops, which looked at items of our collection that related to the origins of yoga, live drawing sessions, looking at the kind of classical Greek form, and calligraphy tutorials as well. And from that, and from this development and engagement with our members, we felt that we were finally ready to start launching our live events program, of which we started last week, and has been incredibly popular. So these events are all free, and it really is focusing on enriching our members' lives, looking after their well-being, and also crucially the retention of that membership too. Other peer organisations have started introducing a donation, which we're thinking we might do in time, but it's really important to us to keep these events free. So what the feedback that we've been getting, if we could go to the next slide, please, Steve. So you can see here some of the examples. It's been so heartwarming to see how our digital strategy has benefited our members, and we've heard a lot from international and regional partners and people that might not necessarily be able to engage with the museum as readily and as regularly. We've actually said that their membership has got a lot better since we've gone into lockdown. You can also see a very simplistic graph here that just shows the click rate, so the engagement of our members with our digital resources, which doubled from March. So it's been really, really positive to have some of these kind of fantastic testimonials coming through. The legacy of this, so if we could go to the next slide. Brilliant. We now feel that we have a captive audience, and an audience that also values digital content, which we didn't necessarily feel that we had previously. And obviously once we reopen, when we're able to reopen, we're not going to be able to reopen as normal, so our events program is likely to be digital for a significant amount of time. But we also really want to make sure that we're still reaching those international members, regional members. So we're looking into ways that we could carry on working with the digital legacy, so live streaming events, and you'll see a few other notes there on the PowerPoint we want to keep on doing. That's really all I've got to say on that. It's a whistle-stop tour of our digital strategy. I'd be really happy to answer any questions, but yeah, thanks again, Peter.
Cool, thank you, Thomas. I think for me, it's really interesting to see what goes on behind the doors at the museum across many cultural institutes, because we know that they especially have had to pivot quite quickly, because perhaps they may not have the resources as a larger FMCG brand or things like that. But now I want to open up to the wider panel for a broader discussion. And I actually want to pick up on a stat from Thomas and what he's seen at the British Museum. So the open rates, for example, of his emails have doubled. You know, there's lots of positive reaction from members saying, you know, we love what you're doing now. So I'll be interested to hear, what are the potential challenges of, you know, once we go back to normal, you know, how do you keep up sort of that level of engagement and content production. So maybe Thomas, if you could start first of, are there concerns that, internally that you have to continue this pace of production and quality and getting those stats that you've hit when people are sitting at home and not distracted?
Great question. I think absolutely, and that's come from both internally and also from our members, that they really do want us to keep on generating this content and as regularly too. The challenge I think with this will be, my job has completely changed from producing events to producing digital content, and I'm doing that almost exclusively at the moment, and it's taking up the entirety of my working week. So once we have to start doing the two together, capacity-wise, I think it's going to be challenging. And same for all of my colleagues. We've all completely changed what we're doing on a day-to-day. So we're looking at ways that we can keep on doing this, ways we can facilitate that in the future. But it's great to have these really positive feedback to be able to put to the museum to say it does have a real key benefit.
I think what just to add something there, I think what's really interesting about what Thomas has presented is when you described your reason for being as enriching people's lives. And as soon as you got to that point, which is what the British Museum is about, which actually isn't just about bums on seats or bums through the door, it's about enriching people's lives, which enabled you to do the history of yoga, which I find fascinating. And as soon as you pivot to that, what do people need? How do we enrich in this time? I think, you can continuously adapt and respond to what those needs are going to be, because none of us really know, what the future holds and what we're going to need, what kind of content is going to, inspire us, distract us, whatever it might be. But I think it was lovely how you described your purpose being to enrich people's lives. And if you go back to that, you'll be able to sort of continually pivot and adapt as the needs progress.
Robin, have you sort of heard through other industry leaders of these challenges of how do you keep up the pace and perhaps changes in everyone's their job descriptions of we've had to temporarily do as Thomas has done to be content producers when perhaps that wasn't part of the role. Is there concerns that you've heard about or can foresee?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's almost gone the other way with a lot of the organisations I work with, and a lot of the, what I see within my sort of streams, if you like. The sort of initial response, particularly amongst the agency community, in and around, how do we keep in touch with people? I think there was some good advice and some less good advice. I think the great advice, and I think this is probably pretty universal, was to embrace your clients. Obviously not literally, that would be bad. You'd need a lot of brewdog for that. But, staying close to the people that matter most in terms of, apart from a safety perspective, but in terms of the people that are kind of keeping the lights on, that obviously makes perfect sense. But very quickly there was created a sort of narrative around, should you even be doing any marketing or sales or new business during this time? And I think quite rightly, there was quite an intense period of initial disruption for a lot of businesses, again, particularly agency businesses. And I think once they came through that disruption, regardless of how well they had coped with it, there was a sense that, okay, now it's time to start talking to other people again. And this is where the advice for me got a little bit off track. There was quite a lot of, it felt quite Emperor's New Clothes. There's quite a lot of, I heard a lot of helping is the new selling. To sort of Thomas's point, how do you add value to an audience? And the idea that you should sort of not be banging them over the head and trying to desperately convince them that you are the right agency partner for them. The idea that was somehow new or progressive is obviously laughable. So the issue was more about, how, should we say less? Should we say anything at all? But again, to Thomas's point, I think it's great advice for any business. If you're going to look to continue to be relevant under different circumstances, obviously you talked about voice. Mel just mentioned context. It's everything. So speaking to a subject matter that you have permission to talk about, and we talk a lot about authenticity, but sincerity, again, as Melda said, is exactly the right word. Can you be credible talking about something which is of relevance to people right now? Then absolutely. all the usual rules apply. You know, you've got to look at how you do it. You've got to look at the model, the process, the tools, the infrastructure of getting that information out. So to your point about job roles, for most businesses that I speak to, it probably shouldn't change a right lot. If you have resource doing this stuff, keep on doing it, but just think a bit more. You know, it's as if empathy is this great untold secret for communicating with people that people have just realized. But of course, it always was the golden rule. So hopefully there's going to be a realization that needs to continue, you know, well beyond hopefully the very imminent end of this pandemic.
No, I think it's you know, quite telling that both you and Melda mentioned BrewDog as an example of a brand who's, you know, done very well in this pivot. Perhaps because, you know, we know BrewDog as being, you know, quite you know, interactive with our community. You know, that's quite clear that it's not just alcohol brand, but there's a lot of value that they add to people they work with, their employees, their neighborhoods. So it doesn't come as a huge surprise to see them, you know, pivoting to, you know, antibacterial gels, for example. Do brands sort of need to put that, the groundwork, I guess if we're thinking historically, would they needed to have done the quality groundwork in order to play on those points of community service? At the risk of sounding false, because I'm sure we've seen emails from brands where, you know, we might have interacted with them once and all of a sudden they're quite effusive and quite emotional. It just doesn't ring true. So interesting to hear what your thoughts on, you know, building the brand purpose before the actual pivot, need for a pivot.
Can I jump in there? Because I would love to hear Melda's view on this, because I think BrewDog is a really interesting example. But to your point, I mean, I got an email from a company that I bought a blind from about 8 years ago. And I don't think I've heard from them since, but it was important for me to know that they were there for me at this difficult time, which obviously I was very grateful for. But BrewDog's a really interesting example. I'm not an expert on them, but certainly within the marketing bubble, they've been quite edgy at times. So just going back to some stuff that Melda was talking about earlier on, sort of having permission to do this stuff and sort of having an existing voice. Just fascinated to hear the answer to your question on whether groundwork is needed or whether it helps you. Do you need it? So yeah, I'm just dead curious to hear.
Yeah, I definitely think the groundwork is needed and is helpful in order to effectively pivot and carry those messages. If we look at the examples I shared, and there are many more from Unilever, Morrison, eBay, you know, it's going back to the foundations of what that brand is that has allowed them to innovate and pivot in the ways that they have. And I think that's crucial. I think we'll see more brands trying to kind of define those values and define a purpose in their world coming out of this. So I think, yeah, like I said at the beginning, I think it's those brands that have those foundations that are going to ride this better. I think it is important. It doesn't necessarily mean that the brands that perhaps aren't as established in their kind of role in the world or purpose can't try to be, right? It's just perhaps be really honest about what that is, and don't dramatize and position yourself as a hero within something. You know, find an authentic, credible place to play. You know, whether that is just meal inspiration for families, you know, find a bit of a credible place to play that's relevant to your audience. And I think you can still be really, you know, authentic and have some emotional resonance at this time. I think it's important for brands to continue to communicate, you know, first and foremost. And I think, you know, so there are ways of doing it. Perhaps the job is just a bit harder and requires some really careful thought in terms of language and tone.
I think just going on that point, when you mentioned the bird's eye example of, you know, them being actually quite honest and quite open of, we are having challenges because there is a higher need for people to eat at home, for example. So it'd be interesting to get your views of, you know, how surprised are you to see brands being quite open and honest of challenges they're facing, and what general reaction is from customers of seeing brands actually not be 100% perfect in their communications with the customers.
Yeah, I think this situation has forced brands to over communicate, which I don't think is a bad thing. And I think where we're seeing it be really effective is when we're seeing open, regular, continuous and sincere communication from leadership. And I think, you know, that translates within an organization. You know, whenever we're working with brands to develop purpose platforms or sustainability strategies, you know, your internal culture and how you embed it first is what's really important. So that over communication and the honesty and the transparency of, we don't know where this goes yet, but this is the building blocks to getting there, or whatever it might be, you know, is crucial at this point. Has that answered your question, Peter?
Yeah, I think for me it was quite, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but it made me feel more able to connect with the brand, to see them. Actually, they're struggling just as much as me, and they're being quite honest about why a delivery might be a day late rather than next day delivery, for example. And it's almost humanizing that, you know, they're made up of people who are facing the same challenges as me. So for me, it was quite me being able to put a bit more trust in these brands rather than being sort of Teflon perfect.
Yeah, honesty does build trust, doesn't it? And I think what we're starting to see now, you know, I'm just thinking of the Gucci announcement just from a few days ago, ending seasonless fashion, which is a massive move for the fashion industry. And the statement being, we've made mistakes. The way we've been operating in the past can't go on. You know, this whole pandemic has given us this great pause to reflect, and so we're going to change things in the future. I think we're going to be seeing more of that kind of honesty come out in the next few months, of brands going, we're operating differently. You know, we had it wrong before, and now's the time to course correct. Which I think is brilliant. You know, it's you know, I hate to talk about any of this in, you know, with words like silver lining and opportunity, because it's been horrific for so many people and so many livelihoods. But if what comes out the other side is more empathy, business acting in a more humane and honest way, well, you know, it's a great thing.
Definitely.
I think, again, just to build on that, one of the things that's really struck me during the process of kind of just getting through lockdown, if you like, being in a position where I get to talk to lots of people running businesses, particularly agency businesses. It's a real privilege to hear just such a breadth of opinion about what they're going through, how they're coping, and without sounding too kumbaya about it, just how much humanity has shone through from those people. Now, you know, there's been some clear trends about how businesses have tended to cope with you know, a drop in client spend, or needing to reorganize, or needing to adjust their cost base to kind of react and keep the lights on. But certainly one of the consistencies that seems to have jumped out at me about how those companies have responded is about the degree to which there is real trust in the institution of leadership in those businesses. So I've had some lovely stories about how people running, again, particularly agency businesses, have done some really proactive and progressive things to get through that immediate disruption. So there was an agency that I spoke to who had actually asked all of their employees, they were quite heavily hit by the pandemic, they asked all of their employees to go away and effectively do a budget so that they could each come back as individuals and state what kind of salary sacrifice they could each stand, on the basis that some people maybe were 22 and still living with mum and dad, others were, you know, had a mortgage and kids, and, you know, much more difficult to economize in the first instance. Just thought, what kind of leadership and what kind of culture do you need in order to have people come back and recommend, you know, a higher or a lower pay cut than the next person, and for that not to be an absolutely cataclysmic event in the company. So I do think that, I hope that, again, one of the positive outcomes of this, and again, I share Melda's sensitivity towards the fact that it is an absolute horror. But having said that, I think there's nothing wrong with looking at silver linings. One of the things I hope will come out of it is that a lot of those great leaders who are perhaps naturally quite humble, they'll maybe be more aware and more validated about just how good their leadership is, And in that sense, I hope the kind of cream continues to rise to the top. Great leaders create great businesses, and I think hopefully a lot of great leaders will start to realize more that they are great leaders, having come through this.
Yes, well, fingers crossed that does sort of come through across many organizations that we're familiar with. Before I ask my next question, I just want to remind everyone who's attending to please use the Q&A chat function. So we can go through your questions in the next few minutes. So I'll just give everyone a chance to do the Q&A before I ask my next question. So Thomas, I noticed in one of your slides that the British Museum membership, it tends to be skewed a bit older, and that one of your concerns was, how would this heavily digital focused content sort of play with that older audience? But the stats and the feedback showed it's they're quite receptive of it. So I guess my question first to Thomas and then to Robin and Melville is, through this period, is this a chance for us to reevaluate or reassess what we think we know about our customers or people who interact with our brand? So maybe Thomas, first to you of your initial reactions to the the stats from the older audiences at the British Museum.
Absolutely, I think a great question. I think we've learned so much about our audiences as well. We had a preconceived idea potentially about who they were, but I think what's happened from this digital engagement is that we're hearing from them a lot more, and that direct contact with them has got a lot better too. So it's opened up this conversation and this way of us really getting to know them, getting to know what they want, getting to know what they're worried about, what they're struggling with at the moment, and steering what we do more towards what they want and what they need. So again, I completely agree with the silver lining there, but that has been something that's been nice actually to feel that we've connected more with our audience, which we never would have imagined would have come out of this really.
So yeah, to follow on from that, I think that's absolutely right. There's a lot of talk about this new normal, which along with the word unprecedented is probably going to be stricken from the record, perhaps even pivot, I don't know. But a lot of the new normal feels a lot like the older normal. Perhaps it's just arriving more quickly. I'm reminded of that William Gibson quote about the future being here, but just not being evenly distributed. So I think one of the trends absolutely is, and this is not new, the idea that the consumer is becoming more demanding, quite rightly. The kind of transparency that, again, Melda alluded to earlier with, there's no hiding place for organizations if they're talking nonsense or if they are going against, what they've said in the past, or if their sincerity is obviously false. I think in the B2B space, which obviously where agencies are, yes, getting to know your customer, I think, is increasingly important, but I think that's part of a much wider trend to acknowledge that they need to be more customer centric. I think too many of those businesses are very one size fits all. For too long, they've not really had any great proposition. They may have had a sort of strap line, but it doesn't really speak to their audience, or at least a discrete target audience. I think the days of agencies basically just going after any CMO with money in any sector where they're not immediately conflicted, that's not a strategy. That's a sort of baseline hygiene factor. So I do think that customer centricity, not just in how they go to market, but how that tailoring towards a specific discrete target audience, how that's, lives and breathes throughout the entire agency customer experience. I think that's going to be increasingly important. So we'll see more agencies taking this time to reflect and thinking more about meaningfully transforming their business model than we ever have done before. I think that is what is happening and what will continue to happen.
Yeah, I think I'm having conversation with with brands more so than ever. I'm hearing clients and brands obsess about what people are thinking and doing and what they need and how their experiences are. And in theory, that's the backbone of good and effective marketing and communications, right? Know your audiences, serve your people. But I think brands are being forced in this time to really get under the skin of what people are thinking and how they're behaving, and that can only be a good thing. It leads to better communications. It leads to more empathetic communications, which I think is great. I think there are things that we're seeing now that, you know, trends such as older people being more online, e-commerce, the transparency point, where our products come from, provenance of ingredients, provenance of skincare products, what are we putting on our skin, all of these trends we're going to see escalate. And so I think, you know, the continuously mining audience insights on changing sentiment and changing trends is going to be even more crucial as we're all on this sort of roller coaster of emotions and experiences.
Definitely. So we have a few minutes left, so I just want to make sure we make sure to answer some of our audience Q&A. So we do have one from Stephen. He says that purpose is about usefulness. If a brand has defined that, then the question in this crisis is, how can it continue to be useful in this crisis? And he mentions an example of the Maltesers' isolation life. So I guess perhaps to add on to that, will there be sort of an added drive for many of these brands to continue to be useful to audiences rather than just provide a product or service, but to continue that level of service to the wider community?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Yeah, I think so, and I think we can define usefulness in different ways. You can be, you know, informative, or you can be distracting, like the Budweiser example. You can be compassionate, like the Nationwide example. There are many different ways brands can find to be useful. The only thing I'd add to Stephen's point, which is a brilliant one, is that I think purpose, as I define it, and it's one of these words, isn't it, in the industry, that there's different definitions and different interpretations, goes a little bit beyond usefulness. It's about making a positive contribution to society at large. And I think the challenge brands will have in continuing that is all of the obvious ones really around resource and the ability to sustain that positive social impact. Because really, if you have defined a core purpose that is having a positive impact in the world, if you're trying to revolutionize the food industry, if you're trying to feed the nation as Morrison's is, you have to commit to that. You know, a purpose is a decade-long lifetime commitment for a brand, and I think that's the question that brands need to be asking themselves before they pivot quickly and say, oh, let's do good in the world. It's what's your sustainment strategy for that, because you can't just dip in and out of purpose.
So again, I'm conscious, Thomas, did you want to jump in? But I certainly have a view to add on to that. I'm reminded with that question, when first time I worked in a content agency 8 or 10 years ago, was the first time I'd come across editorial people. And excuse me, within that business, they had strategy teams, you know, they had creative team, they had account management, had all the things I was used to as an agency person. But then there was also this editorial team. And I asked them what on earth editorial was, because I thought it was something to do with a bit that the editor writes in a newspaper. I hadn't done a lot of homework before joining that company, now I think about it. But the editorial director kind of struggled to answer the question. And it was almost like asking a blind person to describe the color green. She was just sort of scuppered by the question, what does editorial mean? And she said, well, we just make things interesting. We start with the consumer, or we start with the audience. And I said, well, that's not really good enough. Well, everyone says that. So this idea, where I kind of got to with editorial, was that there was a sort of devotion to the audience as opposed to an observation of the audience. And I think certainly in the worst kinds of arrogant strategists, there is a bit of a condescension towards the audience. They're this sort of amorphous thing to be understood. Whereas in editorial people, they love their audience. They serve their audience. There is a nobility of service towards their audience. So that kind of empathy is baked into it. So this is a bit, for me, an extension of the previous question about customer centricity. If you look at, again, I obviously reference agencies all the time because that's what, you know, where I'm sort of mainly focused. But if you look at, you know, all agencies are the same is this kind of common refrain. Well, most magazines or newspapers are much the same. If you look at the Mail and the Guardian, for example, so they're both functionally exactly the same. They come out on the same frequency, they live in the same channels, they are comprised of words and videos and pictures, and they cover the same subject matter, news and sport and horoscopes and, you know, puzzles and crosswords. They are exactly the same. And yet, because they both have a different position on their audience, and they have a view of the world, which is you know, backed up historically for eons. It is baked into every aspect of what they say and what they do. So despite being functionally very similar, they're able to obviously inspire such, you know, different responses and different audiences. So I think there's a good learning for that. If you are absolutely devoted to the needs of your audience and born out of a really keenly held view about how to bring some good into the world, you won't go far wrong.
I think the word you used before about serve is very interesting. I think we're going to see more brands act in servitude of people and society. I think it's a really interesting mindset shift that we're already seeing, and I think that will continue. How can we serve others?
I think, is it Marriott Hotels? I think I mentioned nobility. I think I nicked it off them off the top of my head, and forgive me if this is wrong, but I think it's Marriott Hotels that talk about the nobility of service, in that they genuinely believe it is, again, I'm probably putting words in their mouth, but the idea that they have a real strong belief that it is an act of service to be in the business they're in. And I think and there's something obviously noble about that. I think that's if that's an ethos which is genuinely baked into the way that they, you know, bring people into their organization and select them and train them and develop them and, you know, remunerate them and bonus them and, you know, evaluate them and all that good stuff, then that is going to come across through every pore of every person and every nuanced interaction. It'd be incredibly powerful as opposed to just working in a hotel. Yeah. And I think that kind of, you know, authentic and comprehensive articulation of what is important to them as an organization, beyond getting, you know, as we've said, kind of bums on seats or bums through the door, bums on beds. No. You know, it's a lovely example of where purpose is going to make a fundamental difference to the customer experience.
And Thomas, I guess with you know, just the purpose of the British Museum of the serving the local community, whether, you know, this experience has, you know, added an even greater need to serve members, visitors, students, teachers. So it'd be interesting to hear from you on this this continued need for service.
I think it's really emphasised. I think we've always had the aim of being a museum of the world for the world, and a lot of what we do is focused on the building. It's a beautiful building, we've got an incredible collection, but now it's thinking of that civic purpose that we have internationally as well, and that's really come through from what we've been doing digitally and making the most of that going forward. In terms of working with schools, that's something we do regularly with our on-site programming, but it's also something we've been doing a lot more of, and how we can do that digitally too. We developed an entirely new families offer, and so not just looking at the resources we have for our young friends, but also looking at members with families too. So yeah, there's an awful lot that we want to take from this. I think what's been difficult for us is just the momentum. It's been so intense trying to kind of change and produce all this content so quickly. We actually need a bit of time ourselves just to kind of breathe and really see what we want to do now, where we want to kind of take what we've learned and where we want to go with it.
Okay, well, I'm just conscious of time. I have a feeling we could talk for another hour or two on these topics, but unfortunately we need to wrap up our discussion. So once again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, but I also want to give my special gratitude to Robin, Melda, and Thomas for being a very expert panel on this really hot topic. So to conclude, if you want to keep up to date on things at Distillery, just follow us on our socials at We Are Distillery. And we hope to see you on an upcoming webinar very soon. So once again, thank you to our panelists, and thank you to you for participating.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, guys.
Bye.